The Tale of the Cub and the Pride by Brian Mullins. Narrated by Brian Mullins. Chapter 1. Introduction to characters and the story. Chapter 2. Whiskers White looks for cubs. Chapter 3. Whiskers plans and begins to play the survival game. Chapter 4. The first cub gets eaten by Whiskers. Chapter 5. The 5 other cubs mourn. Chapter 6. Whiskers White looks for a lioness. Chapter 7. Whiskers returns home. Chapter 8. Whiskers confronts the second cub. Chapter 9. The second cub gets eaten by Whiskers. Chapter 10. The 4 other cubs mourn. Chapter 11. Whiskers confronts the third cub. Chapter 12. The third cub gets eaten by Whiskers. Chapter 13. The 3 other cubs mourn. Chapter 14. Whiskers confronts the 4th cub. Chapter 15. The 4th cub gets eaten by Whiskers. Chapter 16. The 2 other cubs mourn. Chapter 17. The 5th cub gets eaten by Whiskers. Chapter 18. The 6th and last cub is chosen. Chapter 19. The 6th grown-up lioness gets eaten after giving birth. And finally, Chapter 20. Conclusion/end of audiobook. Chapter 1. Introduction to characters and the story. Before we begin our story in the hot and steamy deserts of Central Africa, let's introduce our characters and then we shall begin our story. Just like the curious case of Whisper Willet, but the whole point of this audiobook is that being the pride leader is just a fantasy. Let me introduce to you Whiskers White, the white lion, and his pursuit for 6 cubs. His cubs have to grow up and survive to become the perfect mate for the pride leader so that he can reproduce and maintain the pride that he resides himself with and preserve the bloodline. Here are the main characters. Whiskers White, the quote-unquote pride leader, the white lion. Cub 1, Thomas White. Cub 2, Tyler White. Number 4, Cub 3, Brenna White. Brenna. Cub 4, Bruce White. Cub 5, Luca White. Luka. And finally, number 7, Cub 6, Abby White. Our story begins where Whiskers begins to look for a lioness mate to make cubs out of. Whiskers has been searching for a mate to make cubs with for weeks. But weeks prior before his search began, he wrote and spoke out this manifesto of a speech to other lions of other prides.
Fellow pride alike, I must begin a crusade, a search for a true lover's fate, a fate that no one knows of. That would be erroneous to assume what the fate is to begin with, without having acknowledged that being a leader of, or the leader of, the pride, just like being the leader of the pack as a wolf, is just a fantasy. Leadership and lineage is subjective, my fellow cubs. Or rather, future cubs.
Being the leader of the pack is a fantasy, because either you can't be your own dad, or your dad being dead doesn't change the fact that you're still not the leader. And by that logic alone, if the leader dies, surely all the wolves would die. If the pride leader dies, then surely all lions and lionesses would die. Whiskers is now in hot pursuit to find future offspring, wait for one of them to grow up, and hope to God that he can mate with a grown-up lioness of his own